and the theme for today's lecture is Geopolitical Fallout, Multipolarity, and the Erosion of US Dominance. My name is Shiran Elanperuma. I'm based in Colombo in Sri Lanka. I'll be the chair of this discussion today, and I'm also one of the coordinators of Tricontinental Asia as part of the broader Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. I think some of you may have joined our last two lectures, and you may already know that this is the inaugural webinar series by Tricon Asia. A little bit about our institute, for those of you who don't know. The Tricontinental Institute was basically founded around 2018, and since then we've been closely collaborating with political and social movements around the world, as well as progressive research institutes that are dedicated to addressing the social, political, and economic challenges faced by people across the world, particularly in the global south. More recently, we've been experimenting with a regional format to our work, hence the formation of Tricon Asia and the work that we're doing through our Asia group of the Research Institute. We produce a lot of knowledge through regular publications, and we really invite those of you who are not familiar with our work to have a look at this. We have a monthly Tricon Asia newsletter, which you can subscribe to. We have a bi-monthly series of essays called Tricontinental Interventions, Conjunctural Analysis on Asia. And we also have a biannual journal called Wenhua Zongheng, a journal of contemporary Chinese thought, where we basically find, translate, edit, and publish leading Chinese intellectuals and their views on contemporary social issues. Now, I may be a little biased because I'm one of the co-editors of this project, but it is one of the most interesting things we do here at Tricontinental, and I encourage all of you to have a look at it. My colleagues will, I think, shortly share links to all of these publications in the chat. So without further ado, now that introductions are out of the way, I'd like to move on to today's event, which focuses on a key event, I think, in recent history, which is the return to Trump at the head of the US state, and this onslaught of new tariffs, which happened basically a month ago now. It's happened on April 2nd, and the world is still trying to process what this means for the international economic order, for global trade, for global finance, and also, most importantly, for people, the vast majority of people in the global south who are integrated into this economic order. In this particular session, we are looking at the decline of the legitimacy of the World Trade Organization and the rise of regional blocs, including the SCO, the BRICS, and even ALBA TCP in Latin America being some examples. We're also going to discuss the weaponization of the dollar through the use of actions such as unilateral coercive measures, popularly known as sanctions, but really UCMs are the appropriate term here because these are unilaterally imposed by the US. And also debates around this whole concept of de-dollarization. Is the world moving towards a new currency away from the US dollar? For the format of today's lecture, it's going to follow the similar format for the last two lectures. For those of you who are here, we have three esteemed speakers, panelists with us here today. We're very happy to have them. Each will speak for about 20 minutes, and this will be followed by a 30-minute Q&A. We encourage all of you in the audience, please use the chat, submit your questions at any time during the conversation as comments, and we'll try our best to address them all. Our colleagues are going to collect all of these questions and share it with me. At the end of each panelist, right towards the end, we're going to share these questions with the panelists and we'll try their best to answer them. If you're watching this on Facebook and YouTube, you can also share your questions in the comments over there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Sunanda Sen. She is a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute of Bard College in the US. She's a national fellow of the Indian Council of Social Science Research and a visiting professor at several institutions in India and overseas, including Institute for Studies in Industrial Development, Jamia Millia Islamia University, and the Institute of Development Studies in Kolkata. She previously taught for nearly 3 decades at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU. In 1994, she held the Joan Robinson Memorial Lectureship at Cambridge and she's a Life Fellow of Clare Hall, Cambridge. She's contributed to numerous academic journals, authored, I think, at least 4 books. We are very honored to have you here with us today, Professor Sen. You have 20 minutes, and I'll raise my hand when you have 5 minutes left.
Okay. What do I do? I take on myself. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shira. Um, given the topic today, I thought it will be quite appropriate to start from the global political scenario, the geopolitics, how it has been changing. Very briefly, we go back to the earlier days like colonial period. Geopolitics certainly was there, but with some unipolar empires, like Britain having its say on many countries, on countries like India, a few countries in Africa, and then, the Caribbean islands. So, it was a very different period. But then over time, it fractured, and we have a very different, complex scenario where the two world wars came in succession. And that was a period when one can't say that this was a, unipolar or multipolar world. It was fragmented. But, well, it went on, and then we find the post Second World War period when there is a realignment from the British Empire. We find now it is a bipolar arrangement, like the Soviet Union and USA. They are contesting with each other to some extent. I don't know what is happening. Oh, yes, sir. No, no, it's okay. It's okay. Uh, can you give me a time? Yeah. Okay. So done. So then that's how, this whole thing kept on changing. The geopolitics of the global economy. And we come down to, as we find the scene changes, the Soviet Union collapsed. It was decimated, and there was balkanization of the countries associated, Comecon and others. And in the meantime, USA was gaining strength. And so, on the whole, I can say that in the post-war period, USA became a hegemon. Britain was on the fall, and USA had all the power, quite substantial sum of capital. So, on the whole, USA was sitting in the middle. Now, this is the scene. This was the scene, rather. So, then what happened? Then we find gradually there came up certain developments. One such development, which is very important, relates to China. China after 1978, China when Deng Xiaoping he took over, the markets were they came into being. Earlier it was not there, and not just the markets, a few more changes, and then we find that China has now the ability to. China just it was amazing. China came to that almost second largest economy in the whole world after the USA, bypassing Germany. And China's strength came in the form of very steep rise in GDP, then rise in exports as well as trade surpluses, a tremendous rise in the foreign exchange balance in trillions, and so on. These are quite a few things which came up in China, and it gave it a formidable power to assert itself. But it went on slowly, and over time we find that China, well, I'll come to that. That there came a period when China, the rulers in China, they felt they had to assert themselves. And in that context, what they did was slowly, basically, change the policies. And Xi Jinping, when he came to power, I think after Xi Jinping came to power, what he did was suddenly, in 2020, there was a major basic change in Chinese policies where they said, in the meantime, I must say, uh, USA was always on the guard as to, China shouldn't go to the top. And not just that, China is provides a large market, so USA may lose its power, its strength. And so in the meantime, China can do various things. In fact, what was happening, China was having its trade surplus, and the trade surplus was consistently invested in USA. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. It's being invested in USA as China's foreign exchange reserve, but the foreign exchange reserve was dollar denominated, the US Treasury bill. So that was China's contribution to USA in the sense that China was providing large volumes of uh, consumables to US citizens and so on. That's another story. But on the whole, China's trade surplus was financing a large balance in China's foreign exchange. And that was Treasury bill, which was financing USA's budget deficits. Now, this was the story. So in the meantime, USA was pressing China that, look, you are having a currency manipulation by having by having a depreciated currency, and therefore you must appreciate. So 2005 onwards, China just overnight, let the RMB, or the yuan, as they say, the RMB was in the market floating. It went up immediately to some extent, and that pacified to some extent. I must say, USA, that it's no longer currency manipulation. But China also introduced a few other changes, some kind of um, this thing. It introduced a few changes which involved some liberalization, and that led to such kind, like foreign institutional investors, they are allowed to operate in the stock market. Stock market earlier was very carefully controlled during the earlier regime. So between these things, China went through some kind of a trouble. Now then, what was happening that you know, looking at all these things, the government, basically Xi Jinping, he thought that it is time to change the policy. And so overnight, there was a change in Chinese policy from uh, international circulation to dual circulation, where the home market became very major. Now, I must, shorten this story, and I must tell you that China, through this strength, China is looking inwards, and China is also trying to develop a situation where it is no longer dependent on the rest of the world. So this is, and in defiance, even during the quantitative expansion period in USA, China did not change the exchange rate or the interest rate following USA. So this is the story about China, which I thought I need to tell in the context of the geopolitical changes. Now then, USA naturally knows all these, is observing. Now, USA in the meantime has fallen from its, very top position to the current situation where the unemployment, GDP growth rate, various other things we know. US dollar is no longer as strong as before. And however, US dollar still is the medium of transaction. US dollar still is the medium of store value for all kinds of currency assets and so on. So between these things, what is happening is that there is some kind of a rivalry between these two countries trying to see who can win over. Now, in the meantime, uh, President Trump has come to the scene. So President Trump has announced various, ranges of things on which all of you have been discussing last few days. I don't go into that. So between 145% tariff and what is it, 142%, oh no, 47%. Anyway, tariffs are as high and Chinese commodities are not saleable in USA, etc. Now, this is a scenario in the advanced countries. Now, in this context, what happens? What happens to the developing countries? Well, the developing countries face this change scenario. The developing countries like my country, like your countries, they are facing very difficult situation, very, very changed situation. The two kind of sort of giants are trying to outpower each other. In the meantime, what do they stand? I think, in the meantime, well, again, coming back to China, is trying to mobilize some kind of a coordination, collaboration with the Southeast Asian countries, so that that can provide a market if China fails to completely bans the U.S. market. But despite that, developing countries, they tried. The developing countries formed a group called BRICS. Now, the BRICS tried several things, including de-dollarization. Why should you depend on dollar when we borrow money from the IMF? I mean, sorry, it's not like that. Why should the IMF insist on conditional loans? And all these things are because we are borrowing basically in dollar, yes. So when we borrow from each other within the BRICS, BRICS, name is the sort of alphabets for 5 countries which got together. 3 more countries in Middle East have joined, and it provides a large, huge market. Now, in this context, well, the BRICS thought that they can de-dollarize dollar by providing through their bank money which is not dollar, which is in local currency, etc. Now, the developing countries tried, but there are problems internal, as well as USA is threatening that Trump is threatening that it will not be good for you. Beyond that, what can the developing countries do, and what do they face? That's the important question I must address myself, or we must discuss. What do they face? They face a world which is very different, not just geopolitically, but economically. It is more or less certain. IMF has mentioned this in the last report, World Economic Outlook, that the world is going to face, the advanced countries particularly, are going to face a recession, a global recession like the global financial crisis of 2008. Okay. Now, in that case, the exports will be very little, it will be very difficult to export, and the prices of imports may go up. And so trade will be a hindrance, trade will provide some very difficult time. And the capital which comes to these countries, I didn't have time to mention, but that's mostly now speculative capital. FDI is a certain amount, but beyond that, large sums of short-term capital comes to these countries because market has been liberalized. Now, in this context, again, there may be some problem with with capital flows, FDI in particular, but the developing countries, the alternates which sort of are open. I think it's South-South cooperation in terms of trade, in terms of mobilization of capital, in terms of technology, etc., and also forming different groups by which, and also diversify the trade away from in the direction of the Western countries to their own countries. So I think these are some of the things. And lastly, certainly, they need to come out. I have been writing a book which will come out soon, which is on subordination. They are subordinate. I'll just to take 2 minutes. they are subordinated in various ways, many ways. The most important of which, they do not have autonomy over their own policy. They do not have any autonomy to fix their interest rate, to fix their exchange rate, or to fix their reserves, which at a precautionary level are very high, uh, etc. These are, and the fiscal policy is tightened. So between these things, they cannot, follow. They do not have autonomy over their own policies, and they are subordinated, and more so because the market is open, and the capital market anytime can, with some signals that maybe India is imposing some control over capital flows, that immediately the capital will reverse, and India will not get the same flow of capital. In other words, there can be a threat by the market, and the market which is working as an agent of the advanced country capital. So this is the scenario very briefly. I cannot expand it here now, maybe later on comments. So the developing countries need to do something to rectify the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sen, for that very interesting intervention. I think it raises a lot of questions. You've also actually finished.
Just a minute. Did I stop in time? Yes. Yeah.
Yes, you did. In fact, you've stopped 5 minutes early.
Okay, I see. I didn't know that. Anyway, I'll come back later.
All right, great. Well, in that case, we can move on to our second panelist. And just a reminder for everyone in the audience, if you have any questions, please do type them out in the chat. All right. So our second panelist today is Dr. Farwa Sial. She is the head of research and advocacy for the Asian region at the International Development Economics Associates, maybe better known through its acronym IDEAS. IDEAS is a global South-based network of economists focusing on issues of global development. Dr. Sial is also a research assistant in the Department of Economics at SOAS, University of London in the UK. Her research expertise includes political economy of development, development finance in the context of the global financial architecture, and the imperial nature of private sector accumulation in the global South. She's also interested in integrating academic research with political activism and policymaking on a national and multilateral level. Very happy to have you with us today, Dr. Sial. You have 20 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Shiran. Hi, everyone, and thanks a lot to Tricontinental for having me, and especially with such esteemed panelists. Like I said before, it's a tall order to start after Professor Sen, whose expertise is in trade and all things economics, but I'll give it a try. So I'm going to speak on, I've been asked to speak on multipolarity in the context of regional blocs. And I want to start with the idea of what multipolarity means, multipolarity as a concept, and then this idea of a declining US empire. And I think they can be looked at on different interrelated levels. First, there is the end of the liberal order and the surfacing of an explicitly fascist order in the US, but also in countries of the West, including in Europe. So this is not to say that policies were not fascist before the Palestinian genocide, but the Palestinian genocide exposes the role of these countries in a way that we have to acknowledge the shift. So there is no more resort to disguises of soft power, human rights, and so on. However, the end of liberal order also raises the question if it is indeed the end of empire. So imperialism through the liberal order continued before, but can we really say that the empire is in decline with the rise of fascism? And I think the answer can be found in the nature of fascistic policies emerging from the US and the responses by the world at large. So in this sense, we approach multipolarity and the decline of the US as a dialectical relationship, which continues to unfold as the violence escalates. So I want to focus on three things. I will start with a brief overview of China-led regionalism. and how that shapes multipolarity beyond China's own bipolar role. That is, what it does to the rest of the world. And Professor Sen has already covered the basics. I'll simply do a reminder, perhaps. And then I will move to what can be understood as strategic regionalism, so the role of BRICS and ASEAN countries. And finally, I look at what anti-imperial delinking looks like using the case of Sahel countries as well as the axis of resistance. So, I think we need to think of multipolarity as something which is not textbook, right? It's not just economics. There are multiple forces at play, and it's a political, trajectory which is evolving very rapidly. And in giving these examples, I also want to make the case that again, that countries are using a diversity of policies, which includes strategic hedging, diversification, as well as outright delinking. And these should be analyzed with the limitation and strength of these movements, but also in the interconnected nature of the responses to the escalated aggression. That is, as fascism deepens, as aggression deepens, the countries, like Professor Sen was saying, will have no choice but to do something else. So moving on, first, China-led regionalism, I really want us to think about what the world looked like 20 years ago. We always forget this. And this is the enormity of China's rise and transformation of the global economy, including both in the global north and the global south countries. So, the 2000s, which is a period when China goes out and it's going out policy. And after the 2000s, this 20-year period where there is a huge transformation in the productive sector of these economies led by China. So the Belt Road initiatives, infrastructural, socioeconomic connectivity, it happened in a context where nothing existed. I think this is something which is missed. And there are extreme, unprecedented linkages in transport, in trade, alternative financial and capital markets, things like swap lines, which were not possible for countries, alternative sources of debt, and this strong push for Southern norm setting. So if you remember IP waivers in COVID vaccines led by China, among other things. And finally, the look at development, not simply as this idea of social, but also industrial policy. So we forget that before 20 years ago, the idea of development as led by Western donors was really delinked from the idea of what structural transformation could look like. So in short, countries now have some capacity. So the transformation of the productive structures has awarded them with the bargaining power, which was absent before. So having said that, it is arguable that if that capacity is enough, even with the support that they have right now, even with the advancement that they've made, the point is not to say that they are now independent or empowered, but to acknowledge the fact that the rules of the game have changed tremendously. And here, if I give the example of the country where I'm from, in Pakistan, as you know, with the tariffs, Pakistan was one of the countries which also was threatened with tariffs, so 29% on goods on goods with the US. But just one day after the US reversed the tariffs on China, we had extreme escalation in the subcontinent with an incident in Kashmir. And then there is a new kind of agitation happening, which has not happened in this region before, with India threatening to revoke the Indus Treaty and so on. And I think we need to make these linkages about what's happening with more conflict, which is proxy conflict, and at the same time, the removal of, the implementation of tariffs, but a continuation of bilateral trade. So while the US was implementing tariffs or threatening to implement tariffs in Pakistan, at the same time, there was a very strong deal on minerals happening with Pakistan, which is still in dialogue at the moment. So these are all strategies which make it difficult for any kind of regional peace or regionalism to emerge, and we have to understand. And Pakistan's case is, of course, very important with CPEC, with the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and in a very large sense, the inability of Pakistan to really benefit from that opportunity. In the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, which was held in Islamabad, which is quite strategic given the very security conditions of the country, the Indian foreign minister was in Pakistan for the first time. That was after 2015, which is quite significant in terms of the role played by China in harmonizing or rehabilitating relations, which we also see with the oil deals with Saudi Arabia as well as Iran. So in spite of these moves to regionalize, to bring countries together in a way, there is strong problems of interventions and proxy situations which are not to the benefit. Moving on, I want to talk now about strategic regionalism. So here we have the example of BRICS, new members, including Egypt and Ethiopia, 30% of the GDP. However, I think we need to be careful about what multipolarity is meant by different groups. So I think it's arguable that BRICS is a formation of a block of countries acting in national interests, and what might happen might be an outcome of that, as opposed to being collective status quo, which is actually trying to de-dollarize. So there is a debate there, but I think what we can understand is BRICS is an example of strategic regionalism, as is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is a group of 10 Asian countries. And if you think about what's happening with ASEAN over time, the very nature of ASEAN changing from the Asian financial crisis, and what became of these countries in their attempt to regionalize or have some autonomy is very, very significant. So after the Asian crisis, which is of course a very complex crisis led by private investors, led by speculation, in the G7 meetings, Japan proposes setting up a monetary fund to assist countries. But the US and the IMF did not agree. And ironically, they cite moral hazard as a problem. Instead, a total of 100 conditionalities were imposed on countries like Thailand and Indonesia. Subsequently, in 2000s, ASEAN comes up with the Chiang Mai Initiative, regional arrangement of bilateral swaps and repurchase agreements. However, the role of the organization remains quite restrained in complementing as opposed to offering, in complementing the role of the IMF as opposed to offering an alternative to the IMF. So with China's emergence, ASEAN also changes. So it's at the moment is politically and economically bifurcated, with countries which are very economically close to China, but also politically maybe aligned to the US, for example, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. And it remains to be seen what happens under the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is part of ASEAN, and led by China in terms of integrating trade with Japan, South Korea, and even Australia. But ASEAN and BRICS, I think, are evolving. Like I said, they're with escalating tariffs. These blocs have to change their position, and they have to move ahead from this notion of strategic hedging to securing long-term investments, to securing long-term economic prosperity. Finally, I want to move to what I think can be understood as attempts at anti-imperial, so not anti-global, but anti-imperial delinking blocs. And here, I think two examples which we see now, which are very present, is the Alliance of Sahel countries and the Axis of Resistance. So the Alliance of Sahel countries, or the Confederation of Sahel States, which is a formation between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, which was formed in September 2023. And it started as a mutual defense treaty. But mutual defense is not the only aim, because later on last year, this cooperation of defense also transformed to the creation of a confederation and a pact of economic cooperation. So you have to remember that the Alliance of Sahel States is formed in a direct response to the sanctions which were imposed by ECOWAS. ECOWAS is the Economic Community of West African States, a regional organization which is in theory designed to promote economic and political integration in West Africa. And ECOWAS actually started with the imposition of sanctions against Niger following a military coup. And the sanctions were extreme because they were about border closures, no-fly zone, and of course, freezing central banks. So after the threat of sanctions, these countries decided that they actually will leave ECOWAS, and this year this will happen. As a result, ECOWAS will lose something like 76 million people and half of its geographical land area. At the same time, not at the same time, this year, these countries also announced their decision to withdraw from the International Organization of La Francophonie, or OIF, a French organization which is concerned with the promotion of French culture, but these organizations left the organization on grounds of its political interference. So these moves are happening within Niger's evolving role in shaping the contours of the region, first by spurring a national or domestic centering industrialization, but also lobbying for political autonomy of the region based on the principles of sovereignty. And these are things we did not see, 10, 15 years ago. So Niger is doing some really radical policies, including curbing foreign investments which are not performing for the country, prioritizing key sectors, and of course, and lobbying regionally to withdraw from the French colonial currency of the CFA franc, and lobbying to get rid of the colonial outposts of French military, which is remains based in a lot of these countries. Alliance of Sahel countries is also politically embedded in the resistance movement in Western Sahara, which is also quite significant. And at the same time, these countries are moving towards Russia and Turkey. So these are very strong changes which are coming. And these are attempts at reshaping from a regional level. So beyond the multilateral regional treaties, which are under the regional banks, such as ASEAN under ADB, BRICS, which is an independent formation, but quite official, there is attempt to change the rules of multilateralism. And in fact, perhaps it's fair to say that formal multilateralism for these countries is the lowest denominator. That is, they are not following the rules in the same way. Finally, the last example, which I think is very important when thinking about the ongoing genocide in Palestine, is to center the role of military resistance, which is being pursued by a loose coalition of forces, including Iran, Lebanon, and in Yemen. So Hezbollah and Ansarullah, as well as forces in Iraq and Syria. So at the moment, these are the only actors in the world fighting against the genocidal entities and fighting to protect the most defenseless population of the world, which is Palestinians. And they are not an economic bloc. And the regionalization is not along the lines of trade. It's not along the lines of development. It's about resistance. And, we have this notion of romantic resistance in certain pure forms, but this is how resistance really emerges, which does not follow a linear line. And here we must also ask ourselves why Yemen, Niger, and Iran are countries which are not studied in the traditional sense. So I think I've gone through different kinds of regional arrangements, and as I said, I think it's a dialectical process. We have to keep our mind open, and as things escalate, we will see a very different world order. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sial. Again, some very interesting points about the role of regional organizations ranging from ASEAN to BRICS, and also these fairly recent anti-imperialist formations, whether it's the Sahel, which we've been following very closely at Tricontinental, and also this loose sort of, as you said, more militaristic and resistance-oriented blocks in the axis of resistance. And engaged in the defense of Palestine. I'd like to move on now to our third speaker. Very happy to introduce Dr. Samuel King, based in Australia. So Dr. King is a founding member and writer of an organization called Red Spark, which is a new anti-imperialist socialist organization based in Australia. He is the author of a 2021 book, Imperialism and the Development Myth, How Rich Countries Dominate in the 21st Century. He's also penned numerous articles and pamphlets, such as Is China Imperialist? And Should the Cuban Revolution Survive? Dr. King received his PhD from the Center for Strategic Economic Studies, Victoria University in Melbourne. His thesis is very interesting about Lenin's theory of imperialism today and the global divide between monopoly and non-monopoly capital. Again, we're very privileged to have you with us today, Dr. King. You have 20 minutes. I will raise my hand when you have 5 minutes left. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Shiran, and thank you also to Sunanda and Farwa for your comments. I guess I'm able to comment more on the erosion of US dominance aspect of our topic tonight than the geopolitical fallout from that erosion. And I want to make, I guess, an argument about what I think is happening, and hopefully we'll be able to understand, I guess, a bit more precisely than than what is some of the, I guess, very general analysis that's the most common that we hear, not tonight, but in particular, I want to look at the sanctions and tariffs, and I guess very high tariffs may be effectively sanctions, as Professor Sunanda pointed out, and focus on what Trump's latest tariffs on China seems to reveal about the erosion of US dominance. The first point, I guess, is that the massive tariff escalation is in some ways a continuation with the previous policy of US imperialism, at least over the last several years, which is a policy of increasing protectionism. While Trump's tariffs, and there was, of course, tariffs before the current Trump term, and Biden continued the previous round of tariffs that the first Trump administration brought in. But the tariff escalation is one, I guess, form of protectionism. The Biden administration's massive industrial subsidies is a different form, but also a protectionist policy, as is the also significant industrial subsidies by the EU and even countries like Australia starting to follow, or other imperialist countries like Australia starting to follow in that. So why is this happening? Well, I guess the general and obvious point, there's some sort of relative loss of hegemony of US imperialism. We all are probably familiar with, I guess, the longer historical narrative. We look at British imperialism. First, they were free traders. Well, not first, but at a certain point, they were free traders, and then later not free traders as it went into decline. The Americans, after the Second World War, were free trade, and to a certain extent before that. And then not so much, well, certainly not anymore. And I guess the almost ubiquitous assumption made as a result of the increasing protectionism and escalation, tariff escalation recently is, I guess, some sort of terminal decline of US imperialism. Or if you want to look at it from the point of view of imperialist propaganda, then the other angle is the China threat, I suppose, or perceived threat. But this is very, very vague. I mean, what sort of period are we looking at? If we agree that the US is in decline, is it in decline over the next 10 years or 100 years or these sort of, I guess, having some degree of more accuracy affects what society is going to look like in very real ways. So I want to make some comments to try to help us understand, hopefully more precisely, what is the nature of the erosion of US dominance. And to do that, obviously, we need to have an understanding of the nature of US dominance in the first place, or imperialist dominance more generally, which I would argue is, I guess, a similar thing. But looking at the US, I mean, so the historical dominance is based on the monopolization of science and technology, and ultimately through that monopolization over the labor process by the core imperialist countries. Of course, that's only possible on the shoulders of, the general achievements of scientific development of all of humanity, which, no scientific development is possible except on the shoulders of previous human achievement, or I guess in the case of imperialism, you could say the more standing on the head rather than the shoulders of human development. But the basic reason that the imperialist countries could and still maintain a position in the global hierarchy that allows them to remain 5 or 10 times richer than global South countries at least we measure in terms of per capita income, or in US dollars, or in terms of consumption. This is ultimately by their control of the labor process. If you want to summarize the basic argument that I'm making, the imperialist countries monopolize to themselves the process of revolutionizing the labor process. Revolutionizing is the way that Marx put it in the Communist Manifesto, revolutionizing the productive process or the means of production. They monopolize to themselves, that is, the development of new productive technique, either new products or new ways to produce old products. That, I think, is the underlying social basis of the imperialist super profits. The super exploitation of global South labor increases the amount of surplus value available in the system as a whole, while imperialist monopoly over advanced production allows the imperialist states to ensure that they're the ones to grab the greater portion of the surplus value that's produced throughout the world and coming onto the world market. By developing and then bringing to market completely new technology, the imperialist societies, at least historically, guaranteed for themselves years of above average profits, that is, guaranteed to themselves super profits. If a particular country couldn't produce tractors, for example, then they were, of course, available on the world market, but often sold at monopoly prices. Particular region or particular country needs any kind of machine or part, technical service, advanced microchip of a particular type. Of course, these are, well, usually, not always, but usually available, but of course also sold at monopoly prices. The variation of this is where you have the undifferentiated products, but produced with a smaller amount of labor. So the Australian example of this is something like 40% of all of Australia's exports come from the export of iron ore. But if you look at the total amount of labor that's involved in that export of iron ore, and the enormous income received from it, it's something like, I think, just 20,000 people in sort of the largest estimate. If you look at the amount of products, global South products in particular, that are brought in with the money received from the labor of those 20,000 people, only 20,000, we're talking about the labor of hundreds of thousands of people, particularly in China. but of course, all over the global south. So I think this monopoly over the labor process and the highest aspects of the labor process, that's the real basis of imperialism's stranglehold over the last 8 decades, if you like, since political independence, or even earlier than that. I don't think you can really argue that the imperialist countries that represent, how do you measure it, less than 13%, less than 15% of the whole world, can keep down the whole rest of the world's population just through financial trickery or through patents, perhaps, which are legal contracts. These things are, of course, important, and I agree with Professor Sen's comment about the capital market. But I would argue, I guess, that underlying the threat to global south countries by capital flight or other financial mechanisms is the underlying monopoly is the imperialist countries' control over the labor process. So a lot of the analysis on China and China and the US that I've seen tends to focus on particularly a lot of statistics, I guess, that really tend to express the size of the Chinese economy. And it's hoped, or depends by who, hoped or perhaps feared that the massive size of China and of the Chinese exports, for example, will somehow mean and I guess increasing power and ultimately an ability to escape from the imperialist stranglehold, if you look from our perspective. But the anomaly still is that Chinese income is still 6 times lower than the United States, if you want to measure in world money, in US dollars. And the relationship between the Chinese income and US income hasn't really changed. I mean, my PhD was published in 2018, and I've been saying that for the last, 7 years, still talking basically the same, still 6 times lower. So why can't the biggest and apparently most powerful trading nation in the world increase its status, at least in world money, vis-a-vis the US? I think we need to look at the labor process more closely and the division of labor in order to answer that. So what's happening now? Or has China developed the ability to revolutionize the production process? I think the answer is no. In this sense, there's no major new to the world technology that China has brought to market that revolutionized the production process. We look at the historical examples like steam, electricity, oil, computing, digitalization, internet. Those are historical examples. They're not obviously Chinese technologies. And there's no contemporary example of this kind of revolutionization, complete upturning and changing of the production process in a way that can create a new monopolistic position. We're talking about capitalist world market that China has brought. The actual dynamic, I think, is increased Chinese ability to break monopoly, but not to create new monopoly in the way that the imperialist societies have done historically. If you look at the very well-known sort of recent examples, all of them speak to that. So, for example, DeepSeek, one of the Chinese developed AI-powered chatbot. This was not a new or more advanced program than the similar programs that already existed in the United States. The thing that sent stock prices down, that disrupted global markets to a certain extent when it was announced, was that it's basically a cheaper to produce version that is a more simple version and less resource wasting version, wasting power, for example, and other resources, version that achieves a similar or the same outcome. The same basic dynamic is true for another very well-known example of electric cars. It's not that the Chinese electric cars have a longer range, which would be a key thing, or a better in any measurable metric that I can see. You kind of ignore certain hype by, I guess, some car guys, but there's no measurable metric in which the Chinese electric cars are better. Rather, they're competitive with and broke the monopoly of the American electric car maker Tesla. Broke Tesla's monopolistic position, forced Tesla to massively lower its prices, reduced even before Trump started to reduce its market share, or the political factors sort of made that process more rapid again. The same with the batteries. It's not that CATL, that's the Chinese, the largest battery maker in the world, the Chinese company CATL. It's not that they're better batteries than Samsung or Panasonic. Rather, CATL produces lower energy density batteries, but they're not much lower energy density. And they are much cheaper at this stage. That is, CATL's monopoly, if you want to use the word in this context, is of a very different type, almost the opposite nature of the historical monopoly of the imperialist countries. That is, they've simplified the production process. That is the general trend. Notice all these product classes, the examples I've given here, and the same is true for solar panels. Thank you, Shiran. They're not new to the world technologies, monopolistically developed in China. They're all examples of Chinese innovation of existing products, development, but of existing products, often a rationalization of the production process. So the specific type of innovation is simplification, perhaps sometimes rationalization of existing production process. By doing so, it establishes a new type of production process, which, by virtue of being simplified, cannot be monopolized as a technological or scientific monopoly. By being a simplified process, it can much more easily be generalized. So it's much more accessible to producers in other parts of the global south, for example. So any kind of monopolistic position that Chinese producers can, like CATL, which currently is in a monopolistic position, that they can produce on this basis must be very short-lived, or at least that is the very strong tendency. I think this is why China remains 6 times poorer than the USA, but at the same time still threatens the USA's monopolistic position. The China price, if you like to call it that, it has had so much power for a long period on the world market. In fact, replaces the monopoly price. When the China price, so-called, is imposed, that is the breaking of the monopoly price. So China cannot become imperialist, but by more and more, and it seems to be the case, more rapidly breaking imperialism's monopolies, it fundamentally undermines the ability of imperialism to reproduce itself in the old way. Imperialism cannot reproduce the super profits that it's been getting for 12 decades or 8 decades, since 8 decades more after political independence, cannot reproduce that through technical dominance of the labor process anymore if the mammoth investment required to create technological monopolies cannot pay off because the ability of China and other global South producers has started to too quickly emulate or too quickly break the monopoly, undermine the monopolistic price. It seems to be a real crisis, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. King, again for that intervention. I think very sober analysis, and I think much needed, as you said, to counter, some of the hype that may be a bit too excessive at times about imminent changes in the global order. I think at this point, I thank again all three of our speakers, and again I thank our audience for sending us some questions. I think it's a good time now to start answering some of those questions. So I'm going to pose 3 questions, and hopefully our panelists can just note them down, and you can answer them in turn, starting in the same order that we had the speaking. So our first question is by Susanta Kumar Das, who asks, do you think we are plunging into a newer kind of Cold War? That's the first question. The second one is by George Naylor, who asks, when will the coming economic crisis become more apparent? And will it resemble the Great Depression? And what will be the response of the West's imperial economic leaders? Third question, final one for this round. It's by Abhilash S. Kumar. Are the recent escalations in the South Asian region desperate attempts by the US empire to save its declining economy by generating demand for arms produced by the military-industrial complex? I think I'd be especially keen to hear from our panelists from South Asia on that one. Professor Sen, you may start.
Yes, maybe. Right. I'm here there. Okay. I start with the first question, that it is a culmination of the Cold War. I couldn't get the question so much. Is it leading to another Cold War or that kind of thing? I don't think, there is any parallel between the earlier form of the Cold War, between Soviet Union and USA. Now, it is physically, for example, the tariff war, what is it? It is affecting production. It is affecting, as Samuel King just now said, the labor process. I mean, it is not affecting, but it is touching, and it is connected with that. So it is a real process. And here, in the old form of old style of Cold War, I don't think it still prevails. The Great Depression, no, we do not have Roosevelt here with the New Deal of the 1920s, 29, 30. No, it is a very different situation. Unfortunately, it is a situation where the poor will pay for the whole, the whole calamity. I mean, after all, who will protect the unemployed? In already countries, South Asian countries, for example, there is so much of people in the informal sector who are virtually unemployed because they don't have any organization they can go back to for, regular benefits, and they can lose their job anytime. Anyway, we all know what is informal sector means. And that kind of a job is not exactly a proper job. And that apart, even then, so many people are without any kind of job. So now, if the impact comes via tariffs, that some of the already, companies, corporates are shedding some of the workers from their roles. And so if that comes about, what do we do? And we know how these countries, I just mentioned 2, 3 things of how the countries are subordinated in relation to the advanced countries in fixing their policies. For example, the fiscal deficit. In India, there is a rule, there is an act from the year, I think it was 2002 or 2003, the Federal Balance Management Act, so FBMA Act. Now that sort of persuades the central government to keep down the deficit within 3% of the GDP. That's not possible. So it becomes, but every year a desperate attempt is there for the finance minister to cut down the fiscal deficit as much as possible. Now, cutting back the fiscal deficit is not that, I mean, doesn't end there. It means cutting down capital expenditure, cutting capital expenditure by the government. Also, it means cutting back the social expenditure. Any amount which is spent on in subsidizing, the financially excluded people and various other things, lower rate of interest or tariff rates, the electricity duties, all these things. So then, who pays? Who pays? If there is a Great Depression, I think there will be disaster all through the global South. This is what I feel, and it's very worrying, very unfortunate. And has USA taken the role of, yes, I mean, the defense industry was always very aware of the benefits. Why Trump still is hesitant to stop the war in Pakistan, in Palestine, and Israel? There is no Gaza Strip. He's not bothered. Let it continue like that. And similarly, the other front, Ukraine, Russia. He sometimes takes the side of Russia, sometimes Ukraine. It is crazy. It is not just crazy, it is deliberate. So therefore, this is how the American economy works and how much money is funded by that. I mean, there's no data. How much money is funded by the defense industry to the government to run its course. So these are the three things, three questions came to which I responded. I can come back later.
Thank you. Dr. Sial?
There's another question for Samuel. Maybe he should go first.
Sure.
It was a difficult question, though. I was still thinking as well. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, to be honest. The strategy and tactics open to global South countries if they collaborate to take advantage of China's increasing capacity to move more rapidly, break US and other imperialist monopolies. It's perhaps a question that the other panelists might like to answer as well. I'm not sure at this stage.
Okay, maybe I can start and then you can think a little bit about the question as well. So the first question was on the new kind of Cold War, and Professor Sen has already actually answered most of the questions, and I agree with her. But actually, maybe we should also reconsider what the term Cold War meant for the global South. It wasn't a Cold War. It was a very, very active war where millions of people were killed and continued to be killed after the World War. So we should reframe that understanding of the Cold War. And if we think that China's rise has led to a process where there's constant trade escalations and constant proxy wars from Latin America to Asia and Africa, well, I think with the tariffs that will continue to be escalated. And of course, here I tie the question on South Asia, and what's happening right now in Kashmir is. So, since the very beginning, the rift in the subcontinent or the divide and rule was not a short-term strategy. It was a very long-term strategy, which meant that there was permanent call to arms. So it's empowering some very undesirable elements in all these countries, right? And the comprador class manifests in different forms, and therefore there is a permanent war happening on different fronts, whether it's Kashmir, whether it's the border, or whether it's even the question of migration coming from Afghanistan, or, let's just be fair, Pakistan's role in Afghanistan. So all of these are contradictions of imperialism that have to be understood in that way. And I think, unfortunately, this is what we will see. There will be more violence and new escalations and new problems, especially as we see with the South China Sea. And I think it needs to be seen in those lights as opposed to isolated incidences where states are not happy with each other or they're misbehaving. And only then we can understand the economic imperative which forms the imperialist structure, or what Professor Sen rightly calls the state of constant subordination or de-development that is at play. And the another question was on if it's the Great Depression. And so again, we agree with Professor Sen. I mean, the after COVID, the devastation that we see in countries has not reversed. In fact, it's become harder. So in Pakistan, for example, there is a 25th IMF loan, and that's just one example of a country, because you can compare Egypt, then you can compare other countries, and with every loan you have a bit of the state sovereignty simply eroding. And Pakistan and some other Arab countries, actually, they were the lowest cost of living, because the subsidy, which is the right of the population, meant that the degree of hunger or food security was not so high compared to other countries, even India. But we cannot say that case is the same. And these are repetitive attempts which have nothing to do with how the country is moving towards policy, because actually there is no sovereignty when imposing policy. And at the same time, you have a certain kind of leadership which does not then act in the interest of these countries. So I think I've covered all these questions. I think the last question on strategies which are open to global South countries when thinking about China. And as I was saying, that China has been successful in enhancing the productive capacity of a lot of countries. It has also been successful in integrating countries which, for example, are on the Belt Road, but now they can trade with each other, they can form coalitions. But for things to really happen, so, what do we want? What do we mean when we say strategic delinking, or not trading with under the dollar hegemony? I think we talk about de-dollarization, we talk about local currency exchange, we talk about South-South cooperation, we talk about a different kind of development banking system. And these are all political moves as opposed to simple economic ones. They happen when there is space. In a global financial architecture where countries are still embedded with the Bretton Woods institutions under the dollar hegemony, it's very difficult to then say that we have an alternative donor or alternative partner and things will change overnight. So however, having said that, as I was also mentioning earlier, the strategy is in regionalization, is in looking to your neighbor, which are choices which are not available to a lot of countries because of politics. I'll just stop here.
Thank you, Farwa. Actually, Samuel, I have a question that I would like to pose to you based on your intervention. So you made a very interesting observation that China has the ability to break current monopolies through its competitive pricing, but not necessarily to create its own monopolies by revolutionizing the production process, right? And I think that's a very important observation, because you tend to see this analysis sometimes not just from certain segments of the left, but also from right-wing think tanks like, say, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in your country and their critical technology tracker. And there's this narrative that China is leading in what they call critical technologies. But if you say China still doesn't have the capabilities of revolutionizing the production process, and again, from our perspective, that would mean no country in the global south is still able to break that, and then you can't conceivably think of multipolarity without democratizing the labor process, right? What is the main barrier that still exists for countries in the global south to actually partake in revolutionizing the labor process?
Yeah, a great question. In my view, I think the degree of monopolization that has already been reached on the world market means that to the extent that any given economy, any given global south economy is integrated into the world market, to the extent that basically the market becomes the determinant of the allocation of resources, the determinant of the development of that society, that it's not going to be possible actually to break the imperialist monopoly. That is really, I don't think in my view, it's not feasible to have a system where imperialism continues, where you have some degree of continued domination by the United States, Australia, Western Europe, and so on, and at the same time a breaking out of, let's say, the economic stranglehold of imperialism by the global south countries. Those two things can't happen, I don't think. I think if that's the case, then the question of Chinese development to some extent becomes a question of, well, to what extent is it still dominated by essentially the dictates of the market? Or to what extent is the Chinese society and economy organized in a way that is, if you want to use the socialist terminology, that is organized by the plan, basically, and I guess the old debates in the Soviet Union in the even from the earliest days, they would talk about, well, there's the competition, if you like, or the sort of different pools between, on the one hand, the market, the logic of the market, and the other hand of the plan, and the ability of the society to organize according to the plan and to lock out the market logic. I don't see that, particularly given the degree of internationalization of the production process. If you take any or perhaps most complex economies, even the single imperialist country the largest one, even the USA alone is not able to produce. It relies on an international division of labor that involves an international division of labor, both of the imperialist countries themselves, where you have, for example, Holland producing the machines which are responsible for the manufacture of the most advanced microchips, which are then manufactured in Taiwan and Japan and so on, and with software from the United States, United Kingdom, and so forth. And of course, all of this relies on an international division of labor that sits on top of, I guess, the contribution of the global south as well. So yeah, I think that the logic of the market basically is that there's no real escape. But I saw that Professor Sen was indicating a moment ago.
Go ahead, Professor Sen.
Yeah. I was trying to find an answer for myself. I put it as a question that first of all, I observe that the 90-day pause which Trump announced, when did he do? He did it only when he saw the dollar sinking, and also in the market, the holding of the treasury bill by China had fallen sharply, from about 20% to 9% of that entire stock of treasury bills. So between these things and the price of the US those bills, they were coming down. So between these things, what does Trump observe? He observes that the financial sector is sinking. And on that, with those observations, I think he stopped the tariff for this 90-day thing. And he continues now with negotiations. The deal, which incidentally, the developing countries will, I mean, they have no power to deal with that kind of a quote unquote deal where USA is bargaining with them. Anyway, this is a separate argument. So now my question is Trump concerned more for the real economy or for the financial sector? You see, the financial sector in most of the advanced countries, including USA, financial sector has taken over. We all know that out of services, which is now 60%, 50 to 60% contribution to GDP, well, the high value financial sector holds a large sector. So financial sector, I mean, the state is a big beneficiary of this financial sector's performance. We don't know how much the government gets over there. But we know in how many ways the state had been facilitating the advance of finance in most of the advanced countries, including USA. Why universalize banks? Why bring in all, I mean, not just why. I mean, it was beneficial because then the derivatives could come and play around, and the short-term capital could come in and go out, and so on. Anyway, this is the continuing story. So therefore, my question is Trump so very concerned about the real economy? I mean, there is no democracy, I think, I'm afraid, in USA now, because Trump can do whatever, and Elon Musk can, even he is not as powerful. Anyway, so in that context, if there is more unemployment, if the economy, real economy, is in a serious condition, is that more important for Trump than the collapse of the financial sector, which brings back a lot of money and also which holds the dollar in place? So this is sort of, I'm putting it to the panel and other people also. What do you think? Yeah, this is quite perplexing, not just perplexing, but it is an issue where the dominant finance theory that it is the foremost important sector in most advanced as well as in our countries. Now, how much money the government gets in the election from the financial sector? A huge amount, and it's important for them. And therefore, elections, after as the results come out, they get they're compensated for their contribution, that kind. But on the whole, if I put the question again, is the US concerned more about the real sector and or about the financial sector? Let's stop there.
Thank you, Professor Sen. Unfortunately, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask our panelists if you can perhaps respond to that question and also give us your concluding remarks. So maybe we'll start with Farwa and then Samuel.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very difficult question, Professor Sen, and there are many ways, I think, to think about it, because if we say that the current iteration of monopoly capital is finance capital, then we're not simply talking about nation states as well. We're talking about 1% of the world, maybe, who are concentrated, of course, in certain regions of what we see as the West or the global North. But there is also a dispersion in people, for example, who hold dollar accounts or who will then be very highly affected if if there is actually a reverse impact of what I think is increasing fascism manifested in tariffs as one form. So the Trumpian attempt to protect the 1% monopoly capital or finance capital, and of course the class dynamics of what happens within the US, but also globally. And here, of course, this is a fact that we have to admit that even in China, the contradictions of things like individuals holding dollar accounts remains. So how does the US grapple with it? But how does the world grapple with it is something that we will see unfolding. And this question of, is the state a big beneficiary of the financial sector? The state is completely hijacked in the US by the private sector, whether it's finance, whether it's tech, or whether it's the Silicon Valley and so on. So in this instance, it's not the state per se, but the private sector in the US, which I think is the driving force in my opinion. And in terms of my concluding remarks, I think I'm just going to reiterate what I said earlier, that I think multipolarity has to be considered as an open idea. The multipolar world order with the decline of the US could look like many things, and not necessarily a socialist sort of ideal that people want to think, but still there is room for maneuver. But we also must consider that financial instruments coming from the West, including sanctions, including tariffs, are reshaping the world as we see it, and we have very few but also emerging economies which actually are acting in a very different fashion, in a somewhat self-sufficient fashion, or in a different kind of regionalization. And I think we need to study these economies well. So, for example, Iran, which is a country which has been under sanctions for the longest period of its existence, how does it manage? What is the resilience or the diversion that it has been practicing, and what can other countries, for example, learn from it? I'll just stop here.
Yeah, thanks for all of your comments. I'm just going to, I guess, make a brief comment, mostly in response to Professor Sen's question about the motivation for the tariffs. And I guess I'd take a different angle, really. I was looking at a lot of the media work that the various Trumpian representatives, selling the tariffs on the US television shows to the US audience, and how they explained what the motivation was, which is obviously only one angle, but I think a big part of it, and sort of relates to the comment I was made briefly in the presentation as well, about the continuation between the tariff policy as one form of protection and the Biden subsidies as another type of protection. I think a big part of the underlying concern of US imperialism is not only the profit rate in the different sectors, whether it's the financial sector or non-financial sector. Of course, that's the capitalist economy. They're ultimately looking at that, but ultimately, I think from what they said, there's a whole range of strategic concerns as well. I mean, one of the things that they talked about continuously was the US is now only producing 1% of the merchant ships. There's one shipyard in China that's producing more, that is non-naval vessels, than the entire US production of merchant ships. And then something like 90% of the whole world is in either China, South Korea, I think Japan as well, but in particular in China. So then from the perspective of US imperialism, okay, they had some naval, a little bit more naval shipbuilding, but not really significant that either. The perspective of US imperialism, which has also been observing their relative lack of ability to increase or easily increase their production of other inputs of war that they've been obviously starting to use more rapidly in Ukraine, Palestine. They want to rebuild for their planned future wars and future imposition of threat. That the ability of US imperialism to do that is significantly undermined and endangered by the movement and the depletion of the industrial base, the basic industrial base. And I think that is part of their concern around things like cars. I mean, of course, they say, oh, it's about jobs. We want to bring jobs for you back for US workers. But the concern, obviously, of the capitalists is not about US jobs. It's about US profits and the geostrategic or the military ability of US state to remain an effective enforcer onto the global south of the sort of policies that will guarantee US profits in the long run. And I think, very frankly, they see the degree of shift of production to China in particular. These representatives are also talking about, that they were worried that you had larger basic industrial facilities in many cases in Mexico as well, and not the US. Not sure to what degree that's a strategic or security problem for them, but certainly the massive scale of the Chinese economy, even if it's not able to achieve monopoly super profit in the way that the imperialists have historically, still the imperialists' ability to produce their own super profits on the one hand is undermined by the Chinese and other global South ability to emulate and to break the monopoly profits, and then the ability of imperialism to impose its policy through military means is also undermined if strategic inputs are not available. Basic industry is not at the same scale in the US as in China. This is a very threatening, strategic scenario for the imperialists to face. Good. And also the basic inputs, they're worried, we won't have in the case of war, of course, the basic planning scenario, we won't have this or that or the other, and it's going to be too complex for us to assert hegemony in the military way that we want to in the future scenarios that they plan in West Asia, in East Asia, and all over the world. I think that's a big part of it as well. But trying to I guess understand / guess the exact motivations of this or that political representative of US imperialism is, well, it's obviously a fool's game to try to work out what exactly is going on in Trump's mind. But I think some of their strategic concerns are very clear.
All right, thank you, Samuel. Professor Sen, did you have any concluding remarks?
I think I have said what I wanted to say.
All right, great. Once again, thank you to all of our panelists. I apologize to the audience. I know that there were some questions that came in late. Unfortunately, we've gone a bit over time, and some of our panelists have other appointments to attend to as well. I just want to say before we conclude the call, we remind you that we have our final lecture in the series tomorrow. It will be at the same time. And the topic will be Global South Perspectives, Resistance and Survival, looking at how to sort of get through this current conjuncture with Trump's tariff war and how to imagine another alternative for the Global South. So once again, on behalf of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, I thank our panelists for taking the time to be with us, for sharing their knowledge, the audience for engaging, asking questions, advancing the dialogue, and of course, thanks to our technical team for ensuring a smooth conversation. Thank you, everyone, and see you again soon.
Thank
Thank
you. Thanks a
you.
lot.
Bye.
Thank you.